My son sold my cabin while I was under anesthesia, then called my hospital room and told me I had until Friday to clear out my wife's things. He said it like he was reminding me about a dentist appointment. Dad, the buyers want possession quick. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I was lying in a recovery room at Mission Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, with a tube taped to my hand, a heart monitor clicking beside my shoulder, and a nurse outside my curtain, whispering about discharge paperwork. My chest still felt like somebody had parked a truck on it. The surgeon had gone in to repair a valve that had been failing quietly for years. My own son had waited until I was unconscious to try to sell the only place on earth where I could still hear my wife laugh. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten him. I didn't even sit up. I just held the phone closer to my ear and asked one question. Which title company, Nolan? There was a pause. Not a long one, just long enough for me to hear the first crack in his confidence. Why does that matter? It matters because cabins don't sell themselves. He let out a tired breath, the kind grown children use when they think old parents are being difficult on purpose. Blue Ridge Title on Main Street. Closing is Thursday at 10. I signed what needed signing. You just focus on healing. Then he hung up before I could ask anything else. What Nolan did not know was that Blue Ridge Title had already called my lawyer 2 days earlier. And what he knew even less was that the cabin he thought he had sold had not legally belonged to me for almost 9 years. My name is Walter James Mercer. Most people call me Walt. I was 73 years old that spring, retired from the North Carolina Department of Transportation after 38 years inspecting bridges, culverts, and mountain roads from Hendersonville to Boone. I had spent my life measuring stress points other people ignored. Rust under beams, hairline cracks in concrete, washouts hidden beneath gravel, things that looked solid until pressure found the weak place. Maybe that was why I noticed the weak place in my own family before anybody else did. I lived outside Brevard, in a small white house with green shutters, about 20 minutes from the cabin Nolan tried to sell. The cabin sat farther west, tucked off a gravel road near Cedar Hollow, where the hemlocks leaned over the creek, and the morning smelled like wet stone, pine needles, and coffee. My wife, Ellen, named it Mercy Ridge. She said every hard-working soul deserved one place where the world stopped asking for more. We bought those first 11 acres in 1987, back when we still had 2 kids in the back seat, a cooler full of bologna sandwiches, and exactly $3,400 in savings. The cabin was nothing but a sagging hunting shack then. 1 room, tin roof, broken stove, a porch that dipped so badly on the left side that Ellen said it looked like it was trying to kneel. But she stood in the doorway that first afternoon with sunlight in her hair and said, "Walt, this place is tired, but it isn't done." That was Ellen. She could see value in broken things without pretending they weren't broken. For the next 20 years, I repaired that cabin one paycheck at a time. I replaced the roof after Hurricane Hugo sent branches through the back wall. I dug drainage ditches by hand. I built the porch with oak boards from a sawmill in Rosman. Ellen painted the kitchen cabinets butter yellow, planted daylilies near the steps, and hung a brass bell beside the door so the children could ring it when supper was ready. Our son Nolan was 9 when we bought it. Our daughter Beth was 6. They grew up there in muddy shoes, wet swimsuits, and sleeping bags on the floor. Nolan caught his first trout in the creek below the ridge. Beth learned to read on the porch swing while Ellen shelled peas into a blue bowl. Every 4th of July, we cooked hamburgers on an old charcoal grill and watched fireflies rise from the field like sparks that had forgotten to burn out. Back then, I thought memory itself could protect a place. I was wrong. Memory can make a place sacred, but paperwork decides who gets to touch it when greedy hands come reaching. Ellen understood that before I did. She died in October of 2015 after a 10-month fight with ovarian cancer. She was 66, still sharp enough to correct the hospital pharmacist and kind enough to apologize after. The last week of her life, she asked me to take her to Mercy Ridge. The doctor said it wasn't a good idea. Ellen said doctors were paid to give medical opinions, not marital instructions. So I drove her there in my old blue Ford, slow over the gravel, with a pillow behind her back and a thermos of peppermint tea in the cup holder. It was raining when we arrived. Not hard, just a soft mountain rain that made the porch roof tick like a clock. I helped her into the rocking chair, wrapped a quilt around her legs, and sat beside her while the creek moved below us. She looked thin by then. Too thin. But her eyes were still the same green-gray eyes that had looked at a broken shack in 1987 and seen a home. "Walt," she said, "promise me something." I hated when she started sentences like that. "I've promised you everything already. Then promise me one more thing." I looked at her hands folded over the quilt. Her wedding ring hung loose on her finger. "Anything. Don't let the children turn this place into money." I remember the exact sound the rain made after she said it. I remember the smell of cedar in the porch posts. I remember wanting to tell her our children would never do that. I wanted to say Nolan and Beth loved this place too much. I wanted to give her comfort, even if it was just a lie wrapped in hope. But Ellen had always disliked lies, even gentle ones. So I said, "I'll protect it." She turned her face toward the trees. "Protect yourself too." At the time, I thought she meant after she was gone, when the house got quiet and supper for one felt like punishment. I did not know she meant from our own son. After Ellen passed, I kept Mercy Ridge exactly as she left it. Her yellow curtain stayed in the kitchen. Her gardening gloves stayed on the shelf in the mudroom. The brass bell by the door remained polished. Every Sunday afternoon, unless the weather was too dangerous, I drove out there, made coffee in the old percolator, swept the porch, and sat in her chair for 5 quiet minutes before sitting in my own. Nolan hated that, not at first. At first, he humored it. He would bring his wife, Lauren, and their daughter Claire for Easter or Labor Day, and he'd act sentimental for the length of a meal. But after a while, I saw his eyes change. He stopped seeing the porch. He saw acreage. He stopped asking about the creek. He asked about road frontage. He stopped saying, "Mom loved this place," and started saying, "You know what places like this are going for now." Nolan had always been ambitious. As a boy, he turned lemonade stands into neighborhood businesses. As a teenager, he bought old lawnmowers, fixed them, and sold them for twice what he paid. I admired that drive when it had humility attached to it. But adult ambition without gratitude becomes appetite. By 46, Nolan was a residential real estate broker in Charlotte with a leased black Escalade, a watch he couldn't afford, and a wife who treated every family gathering like an opportunity to inventory assets. Lauren was pretty in a polished way, always dressed like she had just stepped out of a magazine ad for kitchen islands and private schools. She called me Walter instead of Dad, even after 18 years of marriage to my son. "Walter, have you thought about downsizing your holdings?" That was how she said it at Thanksgiving in 2023, while slicing pecan pie at my dining room table. My holdings. Like I was a corporation with failing divisions. I looked across the table at Beth. She stared at her plate. Beth had always been tender-hearted, but tenderness can turn into weakness when it meets pressure. She taught 4th grade in Hendersonville, raised 2 boys alone after her divorce, and avoided conflict the way some people avoid snakes. Nolan leaned back in his chair. "Dad doesn't need 2 properties anymore. Taxes keep going up. Insurance too. That cabin is just sitting there." "It's not just sitting," I said. Lauren smiled without showing teeth. "You visit it, Walter. That's different from using it." Claire, my granddaughter, was 16 then. She looked up from her phone and said, "Grandpa uses it." The room went still for half a second. Nolan gave her a look. Not angry exactly. Warning, Claire looked back down. I noticed that too. A bridge does not fail all at once. First, small things stop lining up. Before I go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because this story still follows me every time I sit on that porch. That Thanksgiving was the first time Nolan said the cabin should be sold while I was alive. "Better to handle it now," he said. "Clean, simple, no probate mess. We can put the money into something that actually benefits the family." "What family?" I asked. He frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, when you say family, you usually mean yourself." Beth whispered, "Dad." Nolan's jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "Maybe not," I said, "but it's accurate enough to make you angry." Lauren set her fork down. "We're only trying to help you avoid a burden." I looked at her. A burden doesn't usually have my wife's handwriting in the recipe drawer. Nobody spoke after that for a while. Then Nolan did something small that stayed with me. He picked up his phone and sent a text under the table. Lauren's phone lit up a second later. I was old, not blind. 2 weeks later, he called and asked whether I had updated my will. "I have," I said. "With who?" "A lawyer," he laughed lightly. "I figured that, Dad." "Which lawyer?" "Mine." Another pause. Another crack. "Why are you being secretive?" "Because you're asking secretive questions." He got irritated then, said I was making things difficult, said estate planning should involve the children, said he had a right to know what responsibilities might fall on him. That word, responsibilities, was Nolan's favorite mask for control. I told him my affairs were in order. He said, "At your age, things can change fast." He was right about that. In February of 2024, I collapsed in the grocery store parking lot outside Ingalls. One minute I was loading oranges and coffee into the truck, and the next I was sitting on cold asphalt with a young woman kneeling beside me asking if I knew my name. I did. I knew my name, the year, the president, and the fact that my chest felt wrong. The doctors found a valve problem that had gotten worse faster than expected. Surgery was scheduled for May 14. When Nolan heard, he drove up from Charlotte with Lauren. They arrived at my house with a casserole, 2 concerned faces, and a folder. That folder was the second mistake. They sat with me at the kitchen table Ellen and I had bought in 1979 from a furniture outlet near Hickory. Lauren opened the folder like she had practiced. "Walter, nobody wants to talk about uncomfortable things, but this is the responsible time." Inside were printed forms: durable power of attorney, healthcare power of attorney, HIPAA authorization, a list of accounts and properties with blank spaces beside them. "I already have these documents," I said. Nolan leaned forward. "Old ones, maybe. But you need current ones. Hospitals are strict now. If something happens during surgery, somebody needs authority to act. My authority is already assigned." "To who?" I took off my glasses and cleaned them slowly with the edge of my flannel shirt. "To the person I chose." Lauren's face hardened by a degree. "Walter, with respect, Nolan is your oldest child." "With respect," I said. "That is a birth order, not a qualification." Nolan pushed back from the table. "So who is it, Beth?" Because Beth can barely decide what tires to put on her car. I didn't answer. He looked at me for a long time, then his voice softened. That was worse than his anger. "Dad, I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm trying to make sure nobody takes advantage of you." That sentence sat between us like a snake pretending to be a rope. I looked at the folder. "Leave the papers if you want. I'll review them." Lauren smiled again. "Good, the notary can come tomorrow." "No," I said, "my attorney can review them." The smile disappeared. Nolan gathered the papers too quickly. "Forget it. I can see where this is going." "Where is it going?" "You don't trust me." I looked at my son, the boy who once fell asleep with trout mud on his knees, the man who now watched my illness like it was an opening. "I trust you to be yourself," I said. He left without kissing my cheek or touching my shoulder. Beth called that night crying. "Dad, Nolan says you think we're vultures." "I don't think you're a vulture, honey." She cried harder, because she heard what I did not say. I had already made my legal arrangements years earlier after Ellen died. Not because I expected betrayal. Because Ellen had asked me to be careful, and I had spent a lifetime respecting her instincts. My lawyer was a woman named Margaret Maggie Bell, an estate attorney in Asheville, with silver hair, sharp eyes, and a manner so calm it made dishonest people sweat. Her office smelled like old paper, lemon polish, and coffee that had been sitting too long. She had helped Ellen and me create the Cedar Hollow Preservation Trust in 2015, 6 weeks before Ellen died. The trust owned Mercy Ridge, not me. That distinction mattered more than Nolan could have imagined. Ellen and I had transferred the cabin and the original 11 acres into the trust, along with a separate 43-acre tract across the ridge that most people in the family had forgotten about. That second tract had no cabin, no porch, no sentimental yellow curtains. It was timber, slope, creek access, and one old logging road that connected to a county-maintained road. When we bought it in 1994, it was nearly worthless except to us. Ellen wanted to keep the ridge from being cut into vacation lots. I wanted the creek protected. By 2024, developers had started buying everything within an hour of Asheville. Remote workers wanted mountain views. Investors wanted short-term rentals. Land that once sold for the price of an old tractor was suddenly worth real money. Nolan knew about the cabin. He did not know the trust still held the upper tract. He also did not know that Ellen had insisted on one particular clause. Maggie called it a beneficiary misconduct provision. Ellen called it the greed fence. It said any beneficiary who attempted to coerce, defraud, improperly transfer, encumber, or force the sale of trust property could be removed from future trustee consideration and have discretionary distributions redirected for the protection of the trust's purpose. It was not magic. It did not send anybody to jail by itself, but it gave the trustee documented authority to protect the property and change how benefits were handled if a beneficiary tried to take what had not been given. At the time, I thought Ellen was being dramatic. She tapped the paper with one thin finger and said, "Love them enough to remove temptation." I signed. After she died, I became acting trustee. Maggie kept certified copies of everything. The deed was recorded at the Transylvania County Register of Deeds. The trust certificate was on file. The tax bills went to my post office box, but the owner of record was not Walter Mercer. It was Cedar Hollow Preservation Trust. Nolan never asked to see the deed. Greedy people often skip boring documents because they are too busy imagining the money. When my surgery approached, I made one more appointment with Maggie. It was May 7, 1 week before the operation. Rain pressed against her office windows, and the traffic on College Street hissed outside. I sat across from her in a leather chair that always seemed too low to get out of gracefully. She reviewed my healthcare directive, my financial power of attorney, my will, and my revocable living trust. That trust held my house, investment accounts, and personal property. Different from the Cedar Hollow Preservation Trust. Different purpose. Different rules. My medical decision-maker was my old friend and former supervisor, Thomas Rayfield, a retired county engineer who had known me for 40 years and Ellen for almost as long. Beth was listed as alternate. Nolan was not listed. Maggie looked over the top of her glasses. "Have you told Nolan?" "No. Is he going to be a problem?" I watched rain move down the glass in crooked lines. "He already is." She did not react much. Good lawyers conserve expression. "What has he done?" "Pushing about the cabin. Asking about power of attorney. Talking like my surgery is a closing date." Maggie closed the folder slowly. "Then we'll notify Blue Ridge Title and the county recorder to contact this office if any inquiry comes in regarding Mercy Ridge or Cedar Hollow property." I looked at her. "You think he'd go that far?" "I think you came here because part of you does." That was the thing about Maggie. She didn't hand you comfort when truth would serve you better. She prepared a written notice that afternoon. Not dramatic, just a professional letter stating that any transaction involving the Cedar Hollow Preservation Trust required trustee certification from her office and direct trustee verification. She sent copies to Blue Ridge Title, Mountain View Escrow, 2 local real estate firms, and the county clerk's recording desk. I signed the letter. My hand shook, not from age but from grief. It is one thing to protect property from strangers. It is another thing to prepare defenses against your child. On May 14, I went into surgery before sunrise. Thomas drove me to the hospital. He was 74, tall, stiff-backed, and still wore his white hair in the same side part he had in 1982. He carried my overnight bag and complained about the hospital parking deck the way old men complain when they are afraid but do not want to say so. Before they wheeled me away, he squeezed my shoulder. Ellen would say, "You're being stubborn." Ellen married me for consistency. He smiled. "Come back anyway." The operating room was cold and bright. A nurse asked me to count backward. I remember thinking of Mercy Ridge in October, leaves burning red over the creek. Then everything went black. While doctors were working inside my chest, Nolan was making calls. I learned the timeline later from emails, title notes, and one very nervous real estate agent. At 9:18 that morning, Nolan emailed a broker named Daniel Price at Ridgestone Realty, claiming he had authority to sell Mercy Ridge on my behalf because I was medically incapacitated and unable to manage assets. He attached a scanned power of attorney. It was not the document Lauren had brought to my kitchen. It was an older limited financial power of attorney I had signed in 2012 when Nolan handled the sale of a used utility trailer while I was out of state caring for Ellen's sister. That document allowed him to sign one specific transaction related to that trailer. It had expired by its own terms after 30 days. Nolan either did not read that part or hoped nobody else would. Daniel Price should have caught it. He did not. By noon, Nolan had sent photos of the cabin, tax records, and a suggested list price. By 3:40 p.m., he had accepted a cash offer from a couple out of Atlanta who wanted to turn the cabin into a luxury short-term rental. The offer was low for the market, but cash and fast. Nolan liked fast. Fast makes careless men feel powerful. The next day, while I was still sedated and drifting in and out of pain medication, Nolan signed a listing agreement electronically. He represented himself as my authorized agent. Lauren sent a text to Beth saying, "It's done. Don't let Dad guilt you. This is best for everyone." Beth replied, "I don't feel right." Lauren wrote back, "You never do. That's why Nolan has to handle things." That text would matter later. I woke fully on May 16. My chest hurt. My throat was raw. My thoughts moved slowly at first, like boots through mud. Thomas was sitting beside the bed reading a paperback western with the cover folded back. "How'd I do?" I asked. "You survived," he said, which is irritating but welcome. I smiled, then winced. He leaned closer. "Nolan called twice." I closed my eyes. What did he want? Thomas hesitated, asked when you'd be lucid enough to sign hospital discharge papers. Asked whether I had access to your keys. That was the moment I knew he had started moving. Not suspected, knew. The next afternoon, Nolan called my room. His voice was bright, businesslike. "Dad, glad you're up. Listen, don't get worked up. But we took care of the cabin. I looked at the ceiling tiles. Took care of how? We got an offer, cash. No inspection delays. Closing Thursday. Honestly, it's better than I expected." The monitor beside my bed kept ticking. "You listed Mercy Ridge while I was in surgery. Dad, you were going to drag this out for years. The market is hot now. You're not in a position to maintain mountain property anymore." "Who told you that?" Reality. I could hear Lauren in the background whispering something. Nolan continued. "The buyers want possession quick. You have until Friday to get your personal items out. I'll send movers. We'll store Mom's stuff if you want." Mom's stuff. Not your mother's curtains. Not the quilt she sewed. Not the recipe cards in her handwriting. Stuff. That word did something to me. It did not make me angry in a loud way. It made me cold. "Which title company, Nolan?" That was when he told me Blue Ridge Title. Then he hung up. I lay still for a while after that. Pain moved through my chest in waves. Outside the window, clouds hung low over the hospital roof. A nurse came in to check my vitals and asked if I was all right. "No," I said. She looked startled. Then I added, "But I'm stable. There is a difference." I called Maggie. She answered on the second ring. "Walt, he did it." "I know." I turned my head carefully toward the window. "What do you mean?" "Patrice Dempsey at Blue Ridge Title called yesterday. They received a contract packet involving Mercy Ridge. She saw the trust notice in their file. Patrice Dempsey. I knew her name vaguely. She had been a title officer in Brevard for years. One of those professionals nobody notices until something expensive starts to go wrong. What did she ask? She asked whether the seller's agent had trustee authority. And I told her no. I breathed carefully. The doctor had warned against stress. The doctor had not met my son. "What happens now?" Maggie's voice stayed even. "We let the closing remain scheduled." I opened my eyes. "You want to let him walk into it?" "I want everyone who participated to put their representations on paper in one room. Right now, we have emails and a bad contract. At closing, we'll have attempted execution, witness statements, and a title officer asking the right questions." That sounds like a trap. "No, Walt, it's a record." That was Maggie's way. She did not seek revenge. She built records. Revenge burns hot and disappears. Records sit in folders for judges to read. I asked her what she needed from me. "Rest. Heal. Thomas will bring you Thursday if your doctor permits. If not, we can appear by video." "You think I should be there?" There was a pause. "I think your son needs to see your face when he learns what he tried to sell. If you've ever had family treat your kindness like weakness, you'll understand why I stayed quiet." I did not call Nolan back. I did not call Beth. I did not warn Daniel Price, the realtor. I did not contact the buyers. I took my pain medicine, walked the hospital hallway with a nurse holding my elbow, and practiced breathing without letting my chest tighten. But silence is not the same as surrender. On Wednesday morning, Beth came to the hospital. She stood in the doorway holding a paper cup of coffee and wearing the same worried expression she had worn since childhood whenever Nolan got in trouble and convinced her she had caused it. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun. Her eyes were red. "Dad? Come in, sweetheart." She sat carefully beside my bed. For a few minutes she asked about the surgery, the nurses, the food. Then her hands started twisting around the coffee cup. "I didn't sign anything." "I know." Her face crumpled. "I told Nolan it was wrong. He said you'd thank us later. He said you were getting confused about money. Lauren said if we waited until you died, everything would be tied up and the cabin would rot." I watched her. "Do you think I'm confused?" "No." "Then why didn't you call me?" she cried then, quietly, like a child trying not to wake anyone. "Because I'm tired of being the one everybody gets mad at." That hurt because it was honest. Beth was not greedy. She was frightened. There is a kind of family damage caused not by wanting too much, but by wanting peace at any price. People like Beth don't steal the house. They just stand in the hallway while somebody else carries out the furniture. I reached for her hand. You're still responsible for where you stand. She nodded, tears dropping onto her jeans. I know. I told her closing was Thursday at 10. I told her Maggie would be there. I told her if she wanted to stop being pulled by Nolan, she could show up and tell the truth. Her eyes widened. What's going to happen? I looked at the IV line taped to my arm. Your brother is going to learn the difference between acting like you own something and owning it. She stared at me for a long time. Then she whispered, Mom knew, didn't she? I swallowed. Your mother knew people better than we wanted her to. Thursday came gray and cool, with fog hanging in the folds of the mountains. The doctor did not love the idea of me leaving the hospital for a few hours. But Maggie arranged transport. Thomas argued like a retired county employee who knew every liability phrase in existence. And by 9:35 a.m., I was sitting in the passenger seat of Thomas's truck with a pillow pressed against my chest. Need me to turn around? He asked. No, you look like hell. I just had my chest opened. I was being polite. Blue Ridge Title occupied the second floor of a brick building on Main Street in Brevard. Above a dentist and across from a bakery that sold apple fritters Ellen used to love. Thomas helped me out slowly. Every step pulled at the incision. My body wanted bed. My heart wanted that room. Maggie was waiting inside the lobby in a navy suit, carrying a leather portfolio. Beside her stood a younger attorney from her office named Joel Sutter, and behind them Beth, pale but present. She hugged me carefully. I'm sorry, she whispered. It's straight, I told her softly. Sorry comes later. At 9:58, Nolan arrived. He wore a charcoal sport coat, no tie, expensive shoes, and the brisk expression of a man expecting inconvenience, not disaster. Lauren came beside him in a cream-colored coat, holding a folder and a phone. Daniel Price, the realtor, followed them, smiling too much. Behind him were the buyers, a couple in their 30s named Evan and Melissa Ward, who looked excited and nervous and unaware they had stepped into another family's fracture. Nolan saw me and stopped. Dad? What are you doing here? His eyes flicked to Maggie, then Beth, then Thomas. I was invited, I said. No, you need to be in the hospital. I needed to be in the hospital Tuesday too. You managed without me. Color rose in his face. Lauren stepped forward. Walter, this is exactly the kind of stress your doctors warned against. Maggie looked at her. Mrs. Mercer, please don't offer medical advice in a title office. Lauren blinked, not used to being corrected without apology. Patrice Dempsey came out then. She was in her late 50s, with short dark hair, reading glasses on a chain, and the composed expression of a woman who had seen enough closings go sideways to stop being surprised by human behavior. Good morning, she said. We're ready in the conference room. The room was cold, as title company rooms often are. Long table, water bottles, a bowl of peppermints, stack of closing documents, pens lined up like little weapons. A framed print of Looking Glass Falls hung crooked on one wall. I sat at the far end slowly. Thomas stood behind my chair. Maggie sat to my right. Beth sat to my left. Nolan remained standing. I don't understand why Dad's lawyer is here. Patrice looked at her file. Because there are title questions that need to be resolved before any closing can occur. Daniel Price's smile weakened. What kind of questions? Patrice placed a document on the table. The contract identifies Walter J. Mercer as seller. The deed record does not. Nolan laughed once sharply. That's probably just an estate thing. My mother passed. Dad owns it. Patrice looked at him over her glasses. Mr. Mercer, can you tell me why your father's signature is on the seller line when the seller of record is the Cedar Hollow Preservation Trust? That was the question. One sentence. No raised voice. No accusation. Just a title officer doing her job. And everything Nolan had built in haste began to fall apart. The room went silent. Daniel Price looked down at his packet. Lauren's mouth opened slightly. The buyers glanced at each other. Beth closed her eyes. Nolan stared at Patrice as though she had spoken in another language. What trust? He said. Maggie opened her portfolio. The trust your parents created in 2015. It owns the Mercy Ridge cabin and associated Cedar Hollow parcels. Nolan turned to me. Dad? I held his gaze. You hired a realtor before you asked your father. His face hardened. I was trying to help. A man who is trying to help asks first. Patrice slid another paper forward. We also have a copy of a notice from Bell and Sutter Law, stating that any transaction involving this property requires trustee verification. Mr. Nolan Mercer, you represented in the contract documents that you had authority under power of attorney. We requested the power of attorney. The document provided appears limited to a 2012 utility trailer transaction. Daniel Price's head snapped toward Nolan. Wait, what? Lauren spoke quickly. There must be a misunderstanding. Nolan has authority for family matters. Maggie's voice was quiet. Family matter is not a legal category. Nolan pointed at me. He's recovering from surgery. He can't manage this. The cabin is falling apart and he refuses to see reason. Patrice looked at me. Mr. Mercer, are you aware of and consenting to this sale? I felt every eye turn toward me. My chest hurt. My son's face looked both angry and afraid. For one foolish second, I saw him at 9 years old holding a trout in both hands, grinning like the world had handed him a miracle. Then I saw Ellen in her rocking chair, rain ticking overhead, saying, "Don't let the children turn this place into money." "No," I said. "I am not consenting to the sale." Melissa Ward, the buyer, put a hand over her mouth. Her husband leaned forward. "We wired earnest money." Daniel Price rubbed his forehead. "Nolan, you told me this was clean." "It is clean," Nolan snapped. "This is my family. We had an understanding." Maggie removed another document. "No, Mr. Mercer. What you had was an expired limited agency document and a father under anesthesia." That landed hard. Not loud, hard. Lauren's face flushed. "I don't appreciate the implication." Maggie turned one page. "Then you will appreciate the documentation. Here are the emails sent while Mr. Walter Mercer was in surgery. Here is the representation that he was medically incapacitated. Here is the listing agreement. Here is the text from you to Beth Mercer stating, 'It's done. Don't let Dad guilt you.'" Beth looked down at the table. Nolan stared at her. "You gave them that?" Beth's voice shook, but she answered, "Yes." For the first time that morning, Nolan looked truly wounded. Not because he had hurt me, because someone had stopped helping him hide it. "Beth, you don't understand what you've done." She lifted her head. "I think I finally do." Patrice gathered the closing documents into a neat stack. Blue Ridge Title cannot insure this transaction. This closing is suspended indefinitely. Evan Ward pushed his chair back. "I want our earnest money returned today." Daniel said quickly, "Of course, we'll work that out." Melissa looked at Nolan. "Did you actually have permission to sell this place?" Nolan did not answer. That was answer enough. Chairs scraped. Papers shifted. The buyers stood. Daniel followed them out into the hallway, already talking about escrow, cancellation, and damage control. Patrice remained seated, face professional but eyes sharp. Nolan leaned both hands on the table. "Dad, do you understand what you just cost this family?" I looked at him for a long moment. That was going to be my question. He straightened. "I found a buyer. I solved a problem. You're acting like I robbed you. You tried to sell what your mother asked me to protect, while a surgeon had my chest open." His mouth tightened. "You always do this. You make everything about Mom." "No," I said. "You made this about money. Your mother made it about legacy." Lauren closed her folder. "Legacy doesn't pay medical bills." Maggie looked up. "Mr. Mercer's medical bills are covered. His finances are not the issue." Lauren's eyes narrowed. "How would you know?" "Because I am his estate attorney." For the first time, something like fear crossed Lauren's face. Nolan saw it too. "What does that mean?" he asked. Maggie did not answer immediately. She looked at me first. I gave one small nod. She opened a separate folder, thicker, cream-colored, bound with a black clip. "This is where the matter becomes larger than the failed sale of the cabin." Nolan gave a humorless laugh. "Of course it does," Maggie continued. "The Cedar Hollow Preservation Trust does not only own the cabin parcel, it also owns the adjoining Upper Ridge Tract, approximately 43 acres. Nolan went still. Beth looked at me, startled. She had forgotten too. Lauren whispered, 43? Maggie turned a page. In March, Mr. Mercer received an inquiry from Harlan Development Group regarding that tract and surrounding access rights. Their preliminary valuation, depending on zoning and conservation restrictions, exceeded $1.8 million. Nobody moved, even the air seemed to stop. Nolan slowly sat down. "That land is part of the cabin?" "No," I said. "The cabin is part of the land." His eyes shifted, calculating despite everything. Maggie saw it. "Before you get too hopeful, Mr. Mercer, you should understand something else. The trust was created by both your parents. Its purpose is preservation, family use, and controlled inheritance under specific conditions. It contains provisions addressing beneficiary misconduct, coercion, and unauthorized attempts to transfer trust property." Lauren's voice sharpened. "What does that mean in plain English?" Maggie looked at her. "It means your husband's actions have consequences inside the trust. Nolan shook his head. No, you can't cut me out because I tried to help. I leaned forward slightly, pain pulling across my chest. You moved fast. I moved correctly. He stared at me. Maggie placed the misconduct clause on the table. You were named as a possible successor co-trustee after your father's death, provided you acted in good faith toward the trust property and the other beneficiaries. Based on the documented attempt to sell trust property without authority, Mr. Mercer has grounds to remove you from consideration. In addition, discretionary benefits related to the cabin and ridge can be redirected. Nolan's face lost color. Redirected where? Maggie glanced at me again. I nodded. To the Ellen Mercer Conservation Fund, she said, with family access preserved only for beneficiaries who comply with the trust terms. Mr. Mercer's granddaughter, Claire, is also named for an education and housing subtrust funded separately. Lauren sat back as though the chair had moved beneath her. Claire, I looked at Nolan. Your daughter loved that cabin when she was little. She still remembers your mother teaching her to make biscuits there. She sent me a letter last Christmas, asking if we could plant another dogwood by the creek for Grandma Ellen. She did not ask what the acreage was worth. Nolan swallowed. You went behind my back with my own child? No, I listened to her. Something you stopped doing. His eyes were wet now, but not with remorse yet. Mostly panic. What about me? There it was. Not what about us. Not what did I do. What about me? I felt something inside me settle into place. You did not lose the money today, I said. You lost the trust that would have brought it to you. For a moment, he looked like he might shout. Then he looked at Maggie, Patrice, Beth, Thomas, Lauren, and finally me. Too many witnesses. Too many documents. Too little room left to pretend. He stood so quickly his chair struck the wall. This isn't over. Maggie closed the folder. Legally, that is your right. Strategically, I would not recommend it. He walked out, Lauren followed, but not before looking back at the trust folder with an expression I had never seen from her before. Hunger mixed with fear. That is an ugly combination. The collapse of the sale did not end the matter. Real life rarely gives you one dramatic room, and then rolls credits. Real consequences come in envelopes, emails, invoices, awkward phone calls, and people realizing that pride has a billing department. The buyers received their earnest money back. Daniel Price's brokerage opened an internal review. Blue Ridge Title sent a formal incident report to its underwriter. Maggie sent a demand letter requiring Nolan and Lauren to preserve all communications related to the attempted sale. The expired power of attorney document became a problem. Nobody could laugh away. Nolan hired an attorney in Charlotte who sent Maggie a letter accusing me of being influenced by outside parties during a period of medical vulnerability. Maggie responded with my surgeon's statement that I was mentally competent after recovery. Thomas's affidavit, Beth's statement, the hospital call logs, the trust documents, the title notice, and a copy of Nolan's own email claiming authority while I was unconscious. His attorney asked for a phone conference 3 days later. That was when I knew the fight had changed shape. I recovered slowly. Heart surgery humbles a man in private ways. You learn that getting out of a chair is not a small thing. You learn that breathing deeply can feel like work. You learn that your body, which carried you through storms and job sites and grief, can become a stubborn animal that must be coaxed. Thomas stayed with me the first week after discharge. He made terrible oatmeal and excellent coffee. Beth came every afternoon after school. She swept the kitchen, cried twice, apologized 3 times, and eventually learned to sit quietly without punishing herself out loud. Nolan did not call. Claire did. Her voice was small. Grandpa? Hi, sweetheart. Dad said you're trying to ruin him. I closed my eyes. I'm trying not to let him ruin himself further. She was quiet. Did he really try to sell Mercy Ridge? Yes, while you were in surgery. Yes. I heard her breathing change. Grandma Ellen would be so mad. That made me laugh once, then wince from the pain. She'd be polite first. Claire sniffled. I'm sorry. You didn't do it, but I should said something. I heard Mom and Dad talking about it. Mom said once it was sold, you'd have to accept it. My hand tightened around the phone. When was that? Before your surgery, like a week before. I looked across my living room at Ellen's framed photo on the mantel. Claire, I need you to tell Maggie exactly what you heard. Only the truth. Nothing more. Will Dad hate me? That question broke my heart more than Nolan's betrayal. No child should have to carry a parent's wrongdoing, I said. But hiding it won't make him love you better, she cried then. 16 years old and already learning that adults can make rooms unsafe. 2 days later, Claire gave a statement with her school counselor present. Lauren had discussed the cabin sale before my surgery. Nolan had said, "Once papers are signed, Dad won't fight us. He hates lawyers." Lauren had replied, "Then we do it while he's too weak to make calls." That statement changed the settlement conversation. Nolan's attorney stopped using the word misunderstanding. By June, the matter was resolved without a public lawsuit, though Maggie made sure the settlement had teeth. Nolan and Lauren agreed to pay the legal fees incurred by the trust, reimburse the buyers for documented costs beyond earnest money, indemnify the brokerage from certain claims, sign a statement acknowledging they had no authority to list or sell trust property, and waive any future claim to serve as trustee or manager of Cedar Hollow assets. Nolan fought that last part hardest, not because he loved the cabin, because titles matter to men who mistake control for respect. He came to my house once during those negotiations. It was June 18, hot and bright, with cicadas screaming in the trees. I was on the porch at home, not Mercy Ridge, sitting in a chair with my walker beside me. Beth had just left after bringing soup I did not want but ate anyway. Nolan pulled into the driveway in the Escalade. He looked thinner, less polished. His shirt was wrinkled, and his eyes had shadows beneath them. He climbed the steps without asking, "Can we talk?" I pointed to the other chair. He sat but did not relax. For a while we listened to the cicadas. Then he said, "Lauren and I are having problems." I did not answer. "She says I handled it wrong." That almost made me smile, not because it was funny, because it was convenient. "You did." He looked at me. "She pushed hard, Dad. I believe that. I was under pressure." "I believe that too." His voice cracked. "Then why are you treating me like some criminal?" I turned toward him slowly. "Because pressure explains behavior. It does not excuse character." He looked away. "You always have a line. Yes, must be nice." "No," I said. "It's lonely sometimes, but it keeps a man from becoming whatever the loudest person wants him to be." He rubbed his hands together. I needed money. There it was, finally. Smaller than all his justifications. More honest, too. "How much?" He swallowed. "More than I could get fast. Business. Some investments went bad. Lauren's renovations, credit lines. I thought if the cabin sold, I could pay things down before anyone knew. Before I knew." He closed his eyes. "Yes, the truth should have softened me more than it did. Maybe years earlier it would have. But truth arriving only after exposure is not confession. It is damage control with tears." "That cabin was not an ATM," I said. "I know." "No, Nolan. You knew it was your mother's place. You knew I was in surgery. You knew you didn't ask. You knew Beth was uncomfortable. You knew Claire loved it. You knew enough to hide what you were doing." His face twisted. "I'm still your son." I looked at him for a long time. "I am still your father. But that does not mean I am still your fool," he cried then, not loudly. His shoulders shook once, then again. I had seen Nolan cry when he broke his arm at 12, when his mother died, when Claire was born early and spent 9 days in the NICU. This cry was different. It was the sound of a man grieving the version of himself he could no longer sell. Part of me wanted to reach for him. Part of me remembered Ellen's warning. Both parts were love. That is what people do not understand about boundaries. They are not always built from anger. Sometimes they are built from the last clean piece of love you have left. Nolan signed the settlement on June 27. Beth signed a separate acknowledgement that she had not authorized the sale and had provided documents voluntarily. Maggie did not punish Beth through the trust. I would not have allowed it. Beth had failed to stand early, but she stood when it mattered. That counts. Not as much as never failing, but more than people think. Claire's subtrust remained intact. I also added language allowing her supervised access to Mercy Ridge regardless of Nolan's status, once she turned 18. I did not want a granddaughter punished for her father's greed. In July, I made one final change to my revocable living trust. Maggie read the amendment aloud in her office. My house would eventually be sold, with a portion to Beth, a portion held for Claire, and a smaller controlled distribution to Nolan after debts, legal obligations, and counseling requirements were addressed. Not because I wanted to humiliate him, because handing a drowning man a bigger bucket of water is not kindness. The Cedar Hollow Upper Ridge would not be sold to Harlan Development. Instead, I worked with a local land conservancy to place a conservation easement on most of the acreage. That reduced the speculative value, yes. Nolan would have called that foolish. Maybe some viewers would too. But Ellen and I had not protected that ridge for 30 years, so strangers could stack luxury rentals along the creek and call them Mercy View Villas. The easement allowed the cabin to remain, preserved family access, protected the creek, and created a modest tax benefit that kept maintenance funded. The rest went into the Ellen Mercer Conservation Fund, supporting trail repair, local school field trips, and preservation of small mountain parcels families like ours could no longer afford to defend. When Maggie explained the final structure, she asked me if I was sure. Once this is recorded, Walt, it becomes difficult to reverse. I looked at the pen in my hand. Good, she smiled faintly. Ellen would approve. No, I said. Ellen would pretend to think about it first, then approve. By late August, I was strong enough to drive to Mercy Ridge alone. The first trip back felt like entering a church after a funeral. The gravel road was washed out in 2 places. Goldenrod had grown high along the ditch. The cabin roof needed clearing. A raccoon had tried to get into the trash bin. Real places do not pause for human drama. They keep needing work. I parked the old Ford beneath the poplar tree and sat for a while before getting out. The porch looked the same. A little older, a little more tired. Like me. I climbed the steps slowly and touched the brass bell beside the door. It rang soft, not loud. Ellen had bought it at an antique store in Waynesville because she said every home needed one unnecessary beautiful thing. Inside, dust floated in the light. Her yellow curtains moved in a faint draft. The kitchen still smelled like wood, coffee, and thyme. I stood by the table and let the silence come. For months, people had talked about Mercy Ridge like an asset, port number, valuation, trust property, subject tract, insurable title, potential development. All true words, none complete. A place can be legally described without being understood. I made coffee in the old percolator. It sputtered and complained. I took the mug outside and sat in Ellen's chair first, because I always did. The creek moved below, steady over stone. A hawk circled above the ridge. Somewhere in the trees, a branch cracked under its own weight and fell. I thought about Nolan. We were not healed. People like to imagine forgiveness as a door swinging open all at once. Mine was more like a gate with a chain on it. It could open, but not without deliberate hands, not without hearing the metal move, not without remembering why the chain was there. Nolan began counseling in September. I know because he sent me the appointment confirmation, not as proof for money, but with a note that said, "I don't know how to fix what I broke. I'm starting here." I did not answer that day. The next morning I wrote back, "Starting is not finishing, but it is starting." That was all I could honestly give. Lauren moved out for a while. Whether they repaired their marriage, I cannot say. Beth grew steadier. She started coming to Mercy Ridge twice a month. Not to apologize, but to help. She cleaned the gutters, labeled old photographs, and one Saturday, without asking, replanted Ellen's daylilies where deer had torn them up. Claire came in October. She drove up with Beth, carrying a small dogwood sapling in a black nursery pot. She was taller than I remembered and quieter than a girl should have to be at 16. We planted it near the creek, far enough from the bank to survive floods, close enough for Ellen to have liked the view. Claire pressed soil around the roots with both hands. "Do you think Grandma would be mad at Dad forever?" I leaned on the shovel. "Your grandma was better at Mercy than I am." Claire looked worried. "So yes?" "No," I said. "She would be mad until anger stopped being useful. Then she would expect truth." Claire nodded like she understood more than she wanted to. We sat on the porch afterward and drank cider. The late afternoon sun lit the ridge gold. Beth was inside washing mugs. Claire looked at the porch boards. "Mom said this place ruined the family." I shook my head. "No, sweetheart. This place revealed the family. There's a difference." She thought about that. Will it ever feel normal again? I looked at the trees Ellen had loved, the creek we had protected, the porch Nolan had almost turned over to strangers while I lay under anesthesia. "No," I said. "But normal is not always the goal. Honest is better." Winter came early that year. Not heavy snow, but frost silvering the field and ice edging the creek in thin glass. I spent Christmas Eve at Mercy Ridge alone by choice. Beth invited me to her house. Claire texted. Nolan left a voicemail. I listened to it sitting by the wood stove. "Dad, it's me. I know I don't deserve Christmas with you. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Not for getting caught, for doing it, for making you feel unsafe with your own son. I don't expect you to call back. Merry Christmas." I played it twice. Then I turned off the phone. Some apologies need room to breathe before you decide where to put them. I cooked soup, ate at the small table, and took out Ellen's recipe box. Tucked behind her biscuit recipe was a folded note I had forgotten existed. She had written it years before. Maybe during one of her treatments. Maybe after we signed the trust. Walt, if you are reading this because the children are fighting over what we built, remember this. The property was never the treasure. The treasure was the life that taught us why it mattered. Protect the lesson, not just the land. Love, E. I sat there a long time with that note in my hand. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. The cabin creaked in the cold. The brass bell by the door shifted once and rang so softly I almost thought I imagined it. By spring, the conservation easement was recorded. The failed sale became old news in town, though old news in small towns never truly disappears. Daniel Price left Ridgestone Realty. Blue Ridge Title updated its verification procedures. Patrice Dempsey sent me a Christmas card with a picture of her dog wearing antlers. Inside, she wrote, "Still glad I asked the question." I kept that card in the same folder as the settlement papers. Nolan and I met again the following May, 1 year after the surgery. Not at my house, not at his. At Mercy Ridge, he arrived in an older pickup, not the Escalade. I noticed but did not comment. He wore jeans, work boots, and a plain gray jacket. He looked more like the boy who used to split kindling badly, and less like the man who had tried to sell my grief. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps. "Can I come up?" "You can." He climbed slowly, as if the porch itself had authority now. For a while we watched the creek, then he said, "I drove by that upper ridge road, saw the conservation sign." "Yes, so it's really done." "It is," he nodded. "I used to think you were sitting on money. I was sitting beside your mother's memory." He flinched, but did not defend himself. "I know. That was new." He reached into his jacket and took out a small envelope. I wrote something. Maggie said legal apologies are useless if they're written for leverage. This isn't for that. It's for you. You can read it or throw it in the stove. I took it. "Thank you." He looked toward the brass bell. "I remember Mom ringing that when dinner was ready. She rang it when you and Beth wandered too far." He smiled faintly. I always thought she was mad. She was usually worried first. His eyes filled. "I miss her. So do I." He wiped his face quickly. "I'm sorry, Dad." This time, the words did not sound like a strategy. They sounded small and late and human. I looked at my son. I had imagined this moment many ways. In some versions, I gave a speech. In some, I shut the door. In some, Ellen appeared in memory and told me exactly what to do. Real life was quieter. "I believe you," I said. His shoulders dropped. "But belief is not the same as trust." He nodded. "I know. Trust is built the way your mother and I built this cabin. Board by board, in weather, with receipts." For the first time in a long time, he laughed softly. "That sounds like you." "It should. I'm the one saying it." He stayed 1 hour. We did not solve everything. We did not hug like a movie. He carried 2 bags of old roofing debris to his truck. He fixed a loose porch step without being asked. Before he left, he touched the brass bell with 2 fingers but did not ring it. That restraint gave me more hope than any speech. Now, when people hear what happened, they often ask whether I regret setting the trap. I tell them I did not set one. I set boundaries, recorded documents, honored my wife's wishes, and let a dishonest plan meet an honest file. That is not a trap. That is preparation. There is a lesson in that for every parent who thinks love means leaving everything loose so nobody feels offended. Loose things are easy to steal. Unspoken wishes become arguments. Handshake promises turn into courtroom exhibits. If you have something sacred, write down why it matters. If you have children, love them enough to be clear. And if one of them mistakes your quiet for weakness, do not rush to prove strength with noise. Paper can speak calmly for you, sometimes better than blood. I still spend Sundays at Mercy Ridge. I still make coffee too strong. I still sit in Ellen's chair first. The dogwood Claire planted has taken root near the creek. Its first flowers came out pale and delicate like little white flags that did not mean surrender. Beth brings her boys in summer. Claire comes when she can. Nolan has been back 3 times, always asking first. He has not touched a folder, a deed, or a key without permission. That may sound like a small thing. In families like mine, small things are where repair begins. I keep Ellen's note in the cabin now, inside a metal box with copies of the trust papers, the easement, the title card from Patrice, and 1 photograph of the 4 of us on the porch in 1998. Nolan is holding a fishing pole. Beth is barefoot. Ellen is laughing. I am younger, broader, unaware of how much a man can lose and still remain standing. When the sun drops behind the ridge, the cabin windows turn gold. The creek darkens. The porch boards cool under my boots. Sometimes I think about how close we came to losing it all, not because of strangers, storms, taxes, or time, but because my own son looked at a place full of love and saw a way out of debt. That pain does not vanish, but it no longer owns the porch. Mercy Ridge remains what Ellen said it was. One place where the world stops asking for more. My son thought he sold my cabin while I was in surgery. A title officer asked one question, and the truth stood up in a cold conference room with documents in its hands. Some men leave behind money. I decided to leave behind a lesson.